Better a new face or a pair of experienced hands? We seem to spend a lot of time wondering what kind of leadership is needed in times of crisis. So, what to make of a certain Joseph Robitaille Biden, 80 years young, who first took up residency in Washington as a U.S. Senator a half-century ago, and who, with a Tuesday morning video, formally threw his hat in the ring for a second term as president. We'll ask about Biden's fitness for the job of most powerful person in the world for another 4 years, and the prospect of a rematch against Donald Trump, a mere 3 years his junior. More broadly, is U.S. politics skewed towards seniority? Is it a misperception that the baby boomer generation born before 1965 continues to hold a lock on power? As populations age throughout the globe, what kind of leadership is needed for these tricky times? Today in the France 24 debate, can Biden and Trump, for that matter, convince the voters? Joining us from Washington, Democratic Party strategist Peter Emerson. Good to see you.
Thank you.
With us from New York City, Andres Ganon, Stanton Nuclear Security Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Professor of Political Philosophy, Lex Carlson is the co-director of Morocco's Mohammed VI Polytechnic University's School of Collective Intelligence. Good to see you. Good
to be back.
And nice to welcome. Her job, by the way, is to explain all this to French students. Cécile Coquet-Mokoko, professor of American Civilization at Versailles-Saint-Quentin University in the suburbs of Paris. How are you?
I'm fine, thank you. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, thank you for joining us, the France 24 debate, where you can join the conversation you have on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, hashtag F24debate. So he's already the oldest president in U.S. history. Now Joe Biden wants 4 more years. Monty Francis has more.
That's why I'm running for re-election.
It could be considered the worst-kept secret in American politics. Joe Biden has long said he intended to seek another term as president, and on Tuesday, he made it official. He used his first campaign ad to lash out at what he called MAGA extremists and the danger they pose to democracy and personal freedom.
When I ran for president 4 years ago, I said we're in a battle for the soul of America, and we still are.
Polls show that a vast majority of Americans think Biden should not run for a second term. But despite that, he's widely seen as having a smooth path to the Democratic nomination. No serious challenger on the Democratic side has emerged. 2 other candidates have declared: self-help author Marianne Williamson and Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who espouses anti-vaccine conspiracy theories. A vast majority of Democrats say they would support Biden in a general election, but many in the party are worried about the president's age. Biden is 80 years old and would be 86 by the end of a second term.
It is going to be an historic bid for the presidency. He right now is the oldest president to have ever held office, and running at the age of 82 is going to raise issues.
On the Republican side, polls among GOP voters show former President Donald Trump, who is 76 years old, is the current frontrunner. Former governors Nikki Haley and Asa Hutchinson have declared their candidacies, while others, including Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, former Vice President Mike Pence, and Senator Tim Scott, are also expected to jump into the race.
Yeah, and you've been reacting on the hashtag F24 debate. Melu's been saying the U.S. should have a retirement age for presidents, maybe between 62 and 70, while Mary on Instagram writes that, quote, we're making way too much of Biden's age. Peter Emerson, are we making way too much of Biden's age?
It's ageism. It's an extraordinary demonstration of prejudice and bias that is also not rooted in any facts. So no one even better than Michelle Goldberg of the New York Times, widely read, highly respected, wrote a short while ago, Biden has been a great president. He's made good on uncommon number of campaign promises. He should be celebrated, but he should not run again. That is cognitive dissonance at its worst and best. And maybe Lex, with the expert on collective intelligence, can help us understand why there is an epidemic of cognitive dissonance in this country as it relates to Joe Biden. Because when I look up
hang on, cognitive dissonance, Peter, or simply experience. The left and moderates too revered Ruth Bader Ginsburg But when she decided not to resign and died while serving as a Supreme Court justice, there were those ruling the fact that she didn't know when to stop.
If you can show evidence today, both physically and legislatively, by the way, the only note that Michelle Goldberg adds in her column is that he occasionally stutters, then I'll be happy to try to compare apples and armadillos. That is Ginsburg versus Biden. But right now, Joe Biden is vigorous. And as one friend said to me today, who knows him well, he was old before he was young, in the sense that he's of traditional values. And the question ultimately for voters will not be, is Joe Biden 81 or is Donald Trump 78? It'll be, what have you done for me? And more importantly, what will you do to improve my life coming into what are going to be some very, very choppy waters, at least in terms of finances here in the United States.
Lex Paulson?
Yeah, I think you make a great point about cognitive dissonance. One of the big problems is that for all of Biden's accomplishments, and let's be honest, if you count them off, the $1 trillion, the pandemic relief, $300 billion for semiconductors, $391 billion in climate funding, capping and canceling student loan debt, bipartisan gun legislation, leading the free world against Russian invasion in support of Ukraine. He's done more, arguably, in 3 years than Barack Obama and Bill Clinton did in both of their presidencies combined. And yet, because of our fragmented media system and the fact that most people get their news from social media, or from a very biased, cable news source, only 38% in the latest poll of Americans thought
Hang on,
that Biden...
put the polls aside for 1 second here.
Yeah,
it isn't about the 4 years that have passed, and Peter Emerson also arguing there that he'll be running on his record, but it's about the 4 years going forward.
Sure, and I don't think you elect a president only for their ability to make speeches. Making speeches is an important part of the presidency. I don't deny that communication is critical. And
is he right for the next 4 years?
100%, because the most important thing, I mean, in my opinion, yes, because the most important thing a president does is make decisions about life or death questions for Americans and for people overseas. And if you look at his judgment, that should matter more than whether he stutters. And Joe Biden's judgment in terms of who he surrounded himself with, in terms of the key choices when the Russian invasion occurred, when he had the choice of how to respond to mass shootings, when he's had the choice of how to negotiate around the infrastructure bill or around the climate bill, every point when he's had to make a key strategic decision, he's called it the right way, in my opinion. Even Afghanistan, I would say there was no better course of action available to Joe Biden than Afghanistan. So I would argue that on the question of judgment, values and judgment, those are the critical criteria, and Joe Biden has excelled our expectations.
Yeah, but as Lex is saying, a vote for U.S. president has impact around the world. Too old for the job. Back in February, Joe Biden became the first president in living memory to travel to a war zone without the protection of U.S. troops. Political wonks can argue over whether his gaffes are down to his age or just Biden being Biden.
Putin may circle Kyiv with tanks, but he'll never gain the hearts and souls of the Iranian people. He'll never extinguish their love of freedom.
Of course, he means the Ukrainian people, not the Iranian people. Cécile Coquet-Mokoko, what do your students think of all this?
Well, they have more and more issues understanding the American public and why such societal ills as gun control, opposition to gun control, is so prevalent among American voters. Same thing with abortion and repealing Roe v. Wade.
But when they hear that Joe Biden is running again and that he's already the oldest president in U.S. history, is it a problem, or as Peter Emerson says, we shouldn't succumb to ageism?
Honestly, I agree with Peter Emerson. What they think is that it's going to be terrible if Trump comes back to power because he'll be unchained and unhinged. And that's what they're scared of.
Andres Gannon, your thoughts on this. Should we be talking about his age or not?
I think we should. I think that there's two separate questions here. There's a question of, is he too old to win, and is he too old to govern? And I think on the former, I agree with a lot of the other folks that just a lot of other things matter more. People care about what's going to happen with the economy, with inflation, with the future of Ukraine, and age might matter at the margins. They're not going to be excited about it, but it's unlikely to change who they vote for. I think when it comes to Biden actually governing, the important thing is that he surrounds himself with good and smart people and that he's willing to listen to them. And I think he's demonstrated over the past couple of years a willingness to listen to people around him in ways that make his age less salient. I think we have good examples from President Roosevelt, who was in very, very poor health towards the end of his term. And he sort of was willing to listen to people around him, and that ensured that there wasn't a catastrophic consequence of someone who was younger but in much poorer health.
But Andres, here in France, we've had not one but two French presidents who lied about their medical conditions, and there is a concern when it's a job that puts you through the mill, being president, and now he'll be going out on the campaign trail. It won't be time of COVID anymore. He's going to be expected to pound the flesh every day.
I think it's going to be really hard. I think it's going to be taxing. I think this is part of a reason why Democrats will coalesce around him in the primary, is to not drag out an early fight in anticipation of a later fight in the general election. And I think that our hope is not that Biden is doing great things 3-4 years from now. The hope is that the people that Biden has surrounded himself with are ensuring that these things happen and stay in motion. There's a larger team that's being voted for rather than just Biden. And the job of his election campaign is to make sure that that's how voters see it.
On social media, Biden's 2020 opponent quick to react on Tuesday.
You could take the 5 worst presidents in American history and put them together, and they would not have done the damage Joe Biden has done to our nation in just a few short years. Not even close.
I put this question to you again, Cécile Coquet-Mococo. The prospect of Joe Biden running for re-election, okay, we've weighed the pluses and the minuses, but the prospect of a Trump versus Biden rematch, just in terms of the optics, because a political campaign is a time when you get to discuss the issues. What do you think of that?
I think it's going to be, again...
is it just a rerun of 2020?
Yeah, well, a lot of the rhetoric is going to revolve around saving the soul of America and saving democracy across the world in a global context where autocrats are on the rise.
Is it just we're going to be Peter Emerson? There's a long time to go until those first primaries in January. There's probably people on the Republican side who don't have a lot of notoriety among U.S. voters today who may emerge. Are we going to be back to rehashing the arguments of 4 years ago?
The landscape has changed dramatically here. The Second Amendment has now been proven by, I hate to call them Republicans because I grew up with moderate, reasonable Republicans. The Second Amendment has been defined as far more important to protect than children. So by the time we get to the primaries, there are going to be thousands of children victims of mass shootings. 2, we've got the issue of artificial intelligence that we need to talk about. It is probably the most significant factor in this election for the first time in history. There's also the
artificial
web.
intelligence. You as a political strategist, we discovered in 2016 micro-targeting. How will it upend the race?
Oh, no, that micro-targeting has been used for quite some time. Artificial intelligence now has the capacity to totally deceive. The software to determine whether or not the audio or the visual is authentic or not hasn't evolved as fast as the software to create the illusion of audio or visual. That's just the simple surface. You go on the dark web and it's a whole different matter. So for example, I try to stay in touch with 20 and 25-year-olds because they're the ones who actually are on the front lines and they understand what's going on. Artificial intelligence is going to be a very significant player in this election. And as Cecile mentioned, Donald Trump is willing to do anything to become president again, including destroying democracy. He's already proven that. So I suspect artificial intelligence will be a huge weapon the Republicans will use most malevolently.
Andres Gannon, the race, will it be the same one as 4 years ago?
I think it'll be the same in that it's going to be a lot of negativity. I think what we're going to see here is a lot of people that are voting more against a certain candidate rather than voting for someone. And so in that sense, there's going to be things that are the same. I think that things like the war in Ukraine is going to factor in and just examples of failure of presidential policy. There's going to be allegations from the Republicans about things that the Biden administration could have done differently. And aside from guns, I think that reproductive rights is going to be a very big deal. I think the discussion that we had earlier about Ruth Bader Ginsburg and concern about the Supreme Court is going to be a big rallying cry for the Democratic Party to realize, hey, we need to make sure that we have a say in the way that courts are shaped over the next 4 years, given dramatic consequences that we've seen recently in places like Tennessee and in Georgia are becoming very big deals.
And after his announcement, Joe Biden on Tuesday, quick to burnish his blue-collar upbringing credentials with a speech that took place before a conference in Washington of North America's building trades unions.
Make manufacture greater again was the title of the article. It goes on to say, President Biden appears to be presiding over the kind of manufacturing serve that Trump had promised. Folks, we're not making this stuff up. This is real. It's time to finish the job. Finish the job. But I also...
Four more years!
That's great. Lex Balsi's got a sympathetic audience there. What if it's not Donald Trump he's facing?
I think it's a really, really intriguing question. I mean, we just saw the first of what could be a series of indictments against Trump. The Fulton County, Georgia prosecutor announced yesterday that there will be indictments coming this summer. We still haven't heard from Jack Smith, who's the special prosecutor in the January 6th case. So I think it's highly possible, even likely, that there will be a slump in Trump's support in the primary before the holidays this year, after just wave after wave after wave of legal problems. Republican voters, many of them rally around Trump when they see a common enemy in the Democrats, or what they call Democratic prosecutors. But I think it's highly likely that someone like Nikki Haley, maybe not Ron DeSantis, who has proven to have the charisma of a wet towel at Disney World, but I think someone like Tim Scott or Nikki Haley, a younger, fresher face, very intelligent, talented politician, could well pick up the support that Trump is set to lose as his legal troubles continue.
Does that sound right to you, Peter Emerson? It sounds, after all, like it's his political party right now.
It is his political party, and no one has the capacity and the willpower that Donald Trump has, as Cecile said, to do anything. It doesn't mean that it can't happen. I've been through enough campaigns to know that I say something today that's certain, and it'll be uncertain by tomorrow. I want to make one point about the baby boomers that you brought up, and that the negativity will be a part of the campaign, of course. But Marianne Williamson's candidacy is very interesting in the amount of young people she's attracting. It reminds me in a varying degree to the youth that came out for Obama that we hadn't seen since Bobby Kennedy, and I don't mean the current Kennedy. Marianne Williamson is igniting young people with her hopeful message. I suspect, knowing Biden and the people around him, that in addition to the necessary negativity, there will be a very positive aspect. Let's finish the job. Is your life better today than it was before? And that will help tap in to young people who are desperately trying to find some hope on the horizon. I mean, look at the suicide rates among young people in America. We've got an epidemic of depression and anxiety. So I think Biden is going to tap into that very successfully.
And what's the strategy for Democrats if the candidate is not Donald Trump? Especially if, as you say, it's someone younger and you do have this sort of intergenerational battle.
It's going to be a mini-me. No candidate on the Republican side, if it's not Donald Trump, can simply break away from him. The Proud Boys, the extremists are not going to allow it. The message for the Democrats will be the same. They may be tailored to the specific aspects and characteristics of a candidate other than Donald Trump, but it'll be the same message. Is your life better today than it was tomorrow?
Especially because
yes.
does anyone think that Donald Trump will just go quietly and drop out of the race if another Republican wins the primaries?
Exactly.
I don't think anyone believes that. So, I mean, we have a prospect of if DeSantis or Nikki Haley is the nominee, Donald Trump will run as a spoiler candidate, basically guaranteeing if Biden stays healthy that he will win a second term.
Cécile Coquet-Mococo, there's a feeling that Donald Trump in 2016 tapped into of alienation, of disenfranchisement on the part of a lot of voters. He got people who don't usually vote to come out to the polls. That feeling seems stronger than ever in 2023.
Honestly, I wouldn't speak of disenfranchisement because in American history, it has a name, it's Jim Crow. There were voters who legally were disenfranchised. So I think that's really bombastic to call it that way. And that's part of the whole talking points of making voters believe that they are stripped of their civil rights. While it is not true, there's no persecution of rural voters.
I asked the
not with the
question,
Electoral
Cécile,
College.
because we see the opioid epidemic in the U.S.
True.
We also see, and this is also here in Europe, an aging population. This feeling, we saw it last year in the French presidential election. Far-right candidates were talking up replacement theory. And
Which came from the U.S., by the way.
This idea that somehow our societies are slipping, are falling, that there's a decadence.
You had the same rhetoric at the end of the 19th century in the U.S. Again, that Italian and Greek and Polish immigrants were replacing the Anglo-Saxon stock, and that the citizenry was declining in quality. That is just really old hat.
You didn't have an aging population. You didn't have a lowering life expectancy like you do right now in lots of parts of the U.S.
I think the U.S. is still attractive to a lot of immigrants, and that, as Peter Emerson was saying, third-party candidates very often give ideas, new blood, to the traditional two parties. I think of women's rights in the early 20th century. It didn't come from the Democratic Party.
Peter Emerson?
Yeah, I want to support my colleague in that the American dream, the American promise has always been that life will be better tomorrow for our children than it was for us today. That's the fabric of our democracy. That's the fabric that attracts immigrants to cross from Brazil up into Mexico and wait by the border to try to get into America. And that promise can no longer be guaranteed or kept. And the fight is to either restore that, Joe Biden, or Donald Trump to strip it away and make it forever impossible to return.
I think the other key factor, Peter's right about this, the other key factor is, one thing that's different between 4 years ago and today is the number of young voters who are coming of age in a time of enormous ecological crisis, where you talk to any American voter under the age of 40, and they're going to say that the biggest issue for my future and my children's future is climate. And Joe Biden has successfully, and his team have successfully passed the largest climate legislation that will lower American emissions 40% by 2035. That's action. I'm not saying that it solves the problem or restores hope, but America still is one of the largest emitters on the planet, and Joe Biden has taken the most significant action on behalf of our planet in American history.
Andres Gannon, both Trump and Biden have acknowledged the need to curb illegal immigration into the United States. When you listen to Peter Emerson, that American dream, how is it doing?
I think there's still a belief in the American dream in the sense that people want to have these ideas about opportunity, freedom to choose, and have a different life than older generations that came before them. I think a tricky thing when it comes to the immigration angle is just nobody knows what's actually happening and who's doing what. There's a strange way in which it seems that on the Mexican border issue, both sides have flip-flopped in saying, you have Biden coming out and saying, I am being very tough, the way that Republicans would be. Republicans are saying, no, you're not. And in a way, it should be backwards. Democrats should want the opposite of what it seems that there was an increase in Biden doing. So to me, the border issue is just a great example of whatever your party is doing is what you will decide to support and believe, irrespective of the actual policies there that are happening.
That's right. So when Joe Biden was making his announcement on Tuesday, or at least releasing that video at the United Nations in New York, where Russia wields the gavel this month at the Security Council, its foreign minister was there. Sergei Lavrov was asked by a Russian reporter if he preferred Trump or Biden.
Valentin, unlike journalists who in their line of duty must publicly analyze events that are taking place, the Russian government does not interfere in the affairs of other states.
Andres Genon, always a bit of tongue-in-cheek from the Russian foreign minister in his remarks there. Is this issue of Ukraine, I know it's foreign policy is your remit, but is it really going to matter, the U.S.'s war in Ukraine? I ask because, well, we have this war in Europe right now over here.
I think it matters in two senses. I think first that there is a concern of just a failure is seen as a problem and success you don't get credit for when it comes to foreign policy. I think this is the experience of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is the presidents can really do no good once it comes to the election time, but they can demonstrate that they don't make proper decisions. And so I think that that's the marketing and communication strategy that we'll see coming up to the new election from the Republican administration. I think there's also starting to be big discussions, at least in DC and in policy circles, about East Asia and whether or not that is the future that's relevant for the United States 5, 10, 15 years from now. And I think that we'll see more discussions coming now about ways in which the current approach on Europe is causing the United States to not prioritize things that matter more in the long term, economically, militarily, politically, and so on.
Cécile Coquet-Mococo, last year, Ukraine obviously weighed a lot on voters' minds during the French presidential election. You had a candidate who we saw in their only debate, Emmanuel Macron, who rammed home the point that his opponent, the far right's Marine Le Pen, had received a loan from Moscow. How much do you think there is a Ukraine factor in U.S. politics right now, in this period of growing isolationism that we have in the U.S.?
I think that it's not just a Ukraine question. It's also, as was just said, an Asian question, a Taiwan question, a South Korea question, and seeing the People's Republic of China trying to make peace in its own way and replacing the United States as a sort of policeman of the world. That's what is probably going to weigh on voters' minds in these new election cycle.
Biden this Wednesday, speaking of Asia, welcoming South Korea's president, Yoon Suk-yeol, to the White House, part of a state visit that's key when it comes to handling an aggressive North Korea, Seoul an ally of NATO on Ukraine, and which Washington is reportedly pressuring the South Koreans to follow the U.S.'s lead on trade tensions with Taiwan, particularly when it comes to the export of sensitive things like semiconductors. Meanwhile, at the other end of the earth, on the banks of the South China Sea this Wednesday, joint U.S.-Philippines drills in the coastal town of San Antonio. That's in northwestern Zambales province. And when we look at those images, we realize that whoever the next president is, Peter Emerson, is potentially going to wake up every morning with some kind of crisis to deal with.
Peter? Every day, I agree. Let me just point out that this issue of the new front line from Hawaii onward is very, very important. And having spent so many years in Africa, I've seen the steady march and now basically the wholesale intrusion of the Chinese in sub-Saharan Africa. I was on the phone earlier today with the chief of staff of one of the ranking members of the new House committee that is looking at China's influence, not just militarily, but financial around the world. And there's a growing understanding that China is doing in Latin America what it did successfully in Africa. So I think we're going to see also the Biden administration and the House. By the way, we can't talk about the presidential election without the context of whether Democrats will win back the House, lose the Senate, hold both, so that the environment by the election day could be very, very different, particularly for an incumbent Democratic president. But I know that China is now foremost on most people's minds. And unfortunately, the Ukrainian situation is finding a weary welcome now here in the U.S., not just financially and with the debit I mean, the debt, the debate that's going to start very soon. So I think ultimately we're seeing that Biden is one who's going to be able to lead us through, as he has, where there's no evidence that Donald Trump on any level can do anything but create crisis.
Well, I mean, Trump does have the advantage of speaking directly, and I would say very cleverly, to what you called, Francois, the rising isolationism. I mean, it's just a fact, an ugly truth, that most Americans don't know or care much about the rest of the world. Most Americans don't have passports. Most Americans don't travel abroad. Through my childhood, which was the end of the Cold War, there was a narrative, a grand narrative of the West versus the Soviet totalitarian world. When I turned 21, it was September 11th. There was a narrative of the war on terror, a contested narrative, but it's still a very powerful one. And the war in Afghanistan just ended, essentially, 2 years ago. What is the narrative that will galvanize Americans to care about the rest of the world? Up until now, it's been a very oversimplified, flattened U.S. versus China, China bad, U.S. good. I think there is some truth in that narrative, but Joe Biden, what he needs to do is to go beyond or counter the isolationism of Trump by saying America first, us versus everybody in the world, by saying, no, actually the world is broken down right now into a gang of dictators that knows no restraint and knows no law and will abuse and kill, and what remains of the free world, which does not include just Europe and the U.S., but places like Brazil and parts of Africa, parts of Asia, South Korea, et cetera. And Joe Biden, I think, can speak eloquently to this. He has, as we said, a communication issue with his age, but he feels in his heart that this is a struggle worth fighting. And the question is, can he communicate that to an America that has, frankly, turned off from most of the rest of the world? That is a huge question this year.
Turned off from the rest of the world. Andres Ganon, you heard Cécile there use the expression the global policeman. Let's go beyond the two front runners at this point. Is that what the United States wants going forward?
I don't think so. I think a mistake is the framing or the narrative that worked a decade ago or so that was about the U.S. responsibility to people that were not U.S. citizens. I think that era has ended and the appetite for that is low. I think that a lot of this is partly due to the framing that I think resonates with a lot of voters, that we have to get our domestic house in order before we can help people around the world or deal with things that are beyond U.S. shores.
Because the suspicion here in Europe is that when it comes to China, and there is pushback against China in Europe as well on a laundry list of issues, but the suspicion is from the United States that it also is commercial rivalries.
I think that's right. I think that's the framing that is needed, and I think that's a deep-seated belief that does exist outside of the two primary politicians, is the things that happen in China that happen in Europe matter for the United States. We're seeing this now with sort of second-order impacts of the Inflation Reduction Act and the CHIPS Act, that we're starting to see what electric cars are available. Why don't we have ones from South Korea or from Europe, given the way that these things exist? And I think it's going to be a slower process for people to feel those effects and realize those effects. But that's ultimately going to be what gets U.S. citizens to care about the things that happen in these other parts of the world, is how does it affect their pocketbook here at home?
The Inflation Reduction Act, just to remind our viewers, is basically a kickstarting subsidy plan for the U.S. economy to go green in a hurry. Andres Ganon, whether it's Democrat or Republican, will that be going full speed ahead?
I think only kind of. I think one of the problems is the Democrats succeeded in getting a lot of what they wanted for domestic protection and support for U.S. industries in this regard. And I think we're going to be realizing now and in the next year or two just the technological shortfalls there. There are certain chips and certain batteries that are needed for electric cars that the U.S. cannot produce domestically. And we boxed out allies like South Korea and the European Union as a part of that deal. And they're angry about that. And I think that that's going to have effects on how this is implemented in the United States. So I think the focus on domestic issues there is going to make it slower than anticipated.
And remember, the Republican Party is a very fragile alliance of the business community. It's always been centered upon the Wall Street and the business community on the one side, and the MAGA white nationalist movement on the other side. The business community was the first to split off away from Donald Trump after January 6th, and will be ready to do so again. That could be very dangerous for the Republicans who are trying to win House elections, trying to win Senate elections, governor's elections, and the business community is in favor of these investments in manufacturing and clean energy at places like Arizona, places like Michigan. A $40 billion plan is about to open in Arizona. So, I mean, these are investments that the business community and infrastructure bill. If the Republicans are the party of chaos and pulling back into insularity, I don't think the business community will stay in that fragile alliance very much longer.
Are you suggesting that? Go ahead, Peter Emerson.
I want to pick up on micro-targeting. I think it's very important that we don't get caught up in talking about America and America's voters as some homogenic or much less even semi-connected group. It's not. So my colleague who raised the issue of young people being extremely concerned about the climate are also, since I work with students all the time, are extremely empathetic. They're intolerant of intolerance. They embrace everyone. And I'm hoping that that combined with, as what Cecile said about women coming out based on what the Supreme Court has done to the rights of women, that we'll see a surge of young people voting in this election that we haven't seen since Obama. And that will make a big, big difference.
Interestingly, what made the biggest difference?
Because here just a point on that, here in France, young people, yes, they care about climate and they care about social causes, but there are also a lot of far-right voters.
Absolutely.
Who are young.
And there are many Christian young people in America who are, diehard Trump. Evangelical Christians are the most diehard Trump supporters. I actually think if you look at white, exactly. If you look at Nate Cohn's analysis in New York Times about why Democrats did so well in the midterms, it wasn't actually, and I worked in youth outreach for a long time in the Democratic Party, it wasn't because of greater turnout relatively among Democrat-friendly constituencies, is that Joe Biden and the Democratic candidates on the whole did much better with the single largest group of the electorate, which are still white people without college degrees. Hillary Clinton got absolutely massacred among those people, and Joe Biden did double digits better. And if he can keep his...
And they said it was down to one issue, which was abortion. Is that true?
Well, I think abortion really helped in places like Wisconsin. You saw this judicial race in Wisconsin. Wisconsin is one of the tightest states of the presidential race, and this judge, not a household name, but she won by 11 percentage points in, again, Wisconsin, which is the purplest of purple states, in this race where this judicial race was essentially a proxy for abortion rights. So if Joe Biden can keep his home state of Pennsylvania and win one of Wisconsin, Georgia, or Arizona, any one of those three states could well tip on the question of abortion rights, he's going to be the president for 4 more years.
Peter Emerson, today, the problem with U.S. elections is, of course, there's always a low turnout. But today, by European standards, I mean, is it still a case where the biggest constituencies is the independents, those that are neither Democratic nor Republican?
Well, let me just also reflect on the fact that Barbados has a larger voter turnout than the United States. So that's a little frustrating and a little bit embarrassing, to say the least. People declare themselves as independent, I think more so than ever, but in the focus groups and more importantly in the deeper diving, because focus groups and polling have been pretty much discounted and discredited over the last 10 or 20 years. And that's a big problem too, that Democrats are still fighting political wars with antiquated methodologies, whereas the Republicans have long ago embraced neuroscience, just as one example. So I think a lot of people declare themselves as...
Are those crocodile tears, Peter? I'm sure that you're preparing for 2024.
The crocodile tears?
Yes, when you say the Republicans are better at using the new technology and preparing for and
voter targeting.
And voter targeting.
We bring butter knives to the Coliseum, and they walk in with fully armed clips of AK-47s. It's a little frustrating.
No, he's right about AI, that's for sure. Yeah.
Andres Guénon, you agree?
Maybe not quite as much. I think an important difference to make there, distinction to make, is what the parties are doing and what party supporters are doing. I think that misinformation and disinformation is going to be a really, really large role in the upcoming election. I think on the Republican end, it's going to be more about passivity than active use of these tools by the sort of actual political leaders at the national and local level. And so I think that what we've seen with current social media about turning a blind eye to misinformation and sort of masking of who identities are, et cetera, that's what's going to matter. And it's going to be a question of letting that matter as opposed to actually engaging in those strategies by the people that are running for office and their teams themselves.
So you just had, Andres, the most popular, highest rated talk show host on the conservative channel Fox News leave, and people wondering, does that mean there's going to be more of a middle ground, or is everybody just going to stay in their own echo chamber?
I think stay in the same echo chamber. I think we're seeing a lot of the discussions that happened when Bill O'Reilly left that same slot, and the concern was he was a big deal. What's going to happen next? And Tucker filled it incredibly quickly. I don't know who's going to fill in, but I think in terms of the messaging, it'll be largely the same. And so I think people tend to follow the news that confirms their prior beliefs as opposed to looking for those things to be changed or shaken. So absent the uncomfortable Thanksgiving conversations with family, I don't think people are going to be changing the sources of information that they have.
Let me ask you this, Cécile, is this election in next year, is it going to be about the message the candidates put forward, or, as you just heard, the way they campaign?
I would say both, but I feel it would be really important for U.S. democracy if the question of states' rights versus what becomes national law for all American citizens, that should matter, especially with what we've seen in Texas, with one federal judge, essentially stating how women should use their bodies and whether or not they have a choice. So, I mean, historically, Republicans, at least since the mid-1960s, have been the champions of states' rights. And so it would be wise on the Democratic side to put Republicans in front of their own contradictions.
Yeah, I still agree with Cécile, never underestimate the importance of states and the entity of the state in the American system. Someone asked me today, who are you going to vote for? And I said, honestly, we talked about disenfranchisement. It doesn't matter. I vote by mail in Massachusetts. This election is going to come down to a few thousand people in Wisconsin, a few thousand people in Georgia, and a few thousand people in Arizona, and nobody else really will matter. And let's not underestimate the degree to which, to pick up on the media point, everything is fragmented. The source of information are fragmented. Fox News will certainly play a role. It's the number one watched cable news network. But you go and knock on doors in a place like Eau Claire, Wisconsin, or Tempe, Arizona, you're going to hear things you've never heard in New York and Washington and Los Angeles. There's a kind of a chaos theory that operates when you go knocking on doors.
Did you say knock on doors? Is
Yeah.
that what you have to do in 2024 still?
Well, not with the mass shootings of people on their doorstep, I think, unfortunately. But I will say this, as someone who helped introduce door-to-door campaigning in France, there's still a huge premium in being able to have face-to-face conversations. If it weren't for the epidemic of gun violence, I think it would be the only way of cutting through this chaos. But I think I'm afraid that Peter's right. It'll be an artificial intelligence and micro-targeting driven election.
No knocking on doors, Peter Emerson?
No, well, some people are willing to give their lives for democracy. Let's hope they are, and hopefully get their funeral expenses picked up by the local Democratic Party. But otherwise, I wouldn't go near a front door. I just did some campaigning out where I live on Long Island with a local selectman candidate. It was the most invigorating and hopeful experience I've had in 40 years. But the reality is you can't run a national campaign that's estimated probably around $2 billion for each candidate at the presidential level. Montana, for instance, a very small state in terms of media, $100 million each candidate. So we're looking at money on a scale that we haven't seen. We've got glimpses of it. And consequently, it is going to be media-driven, artificial intelligence, and a lot of surrogates who will hopefully try to drive people to the polls. And one important point is
Very quickly, we're out of time, Peter. We'll have to leave it there, unfortunately. Sorry about that. But yeah, as we can see, there's still a lot of money to be raised before those first primaries in January. I want to thank you, Peter Emerson, for joining us from Washington. I want to thank Andres Ganon in New York City, Cécile Coquet-Mokoko, Lex Paulson. Thank you for being with us here in the France 24 debate.